Football hasn't changed. At least that's what most people think. Pitch is still the same size. There are still 11 players on each team. The offside rule still exists. The objective is still simple: score more goals than the other team. And yet, if you watch a match from 20 years ago and compare it to one today, something feels different almost immediately. The game feels faster, more intense, more crowded. Space seems to disappear the moment it appears. Players are closing each other down before they can even look up. Midfielders are covering areas that seem impossible. Defenders are doing things defenders were never supposed to do. And managers now influence matches in ways that would have sounded ridiculous a generation ago. What's strange is that most fans never noticed this transformation happening, because it didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, season after season, manager after manager, innovation after innovation, until one day football became a completely different game, and most of us didn't even realize it. Today we're going to look at how football quietly changed forever, not through new rules, not through new technology, but through one simple idea: the battle for space. And once you see it, you'll never watch football the same way again. Let's go back for a moment. Think about the football you grew up watching. Maybe it was the 2006 World Cup. Maybe it was Arsenal's Invincibles. Maybe it was AC Milan. Maybe it was Manchester United under Sir Alex Ferguson. The details don't matter. What matters is the feeling. When you watch matches from that era today, something immediately stands out. There's space everywhere. Midfielders receive the ball and actually have time to think. Fullbacks often stay in their own half. Teams defend deeper. Players can turn, look up, take an extra touch, and then decide what they want to do. Modern football rarely allows that luxury. Today, the moment a player receives the ball, someone is already sprinting toward them. The pressure arrives almost instantly. And that's because football's relationship with space has completely changed. For decades, football was largely about finding space. Today, football is equally about destroying it. And that single shift has transformed everything. The speed, the tactics, the players, the managers, even the positions themselves. But to understand why, we need to talk about a revolution that began long before most fans realized it was happening. If modern football has a villain, a hero, and a mastermind all rolled into one, it's pressing. Because if you could travel back in time and show a modern match to a football fan from the 1980s or even the early 2000s, the first thing they would notice wouldn't be the formations. It wouldn't be the technology. It wouldn't even be the players. It would be the pressure, the sheer amount of pressure. Today, footballers are hunted. The moment they receive the ball, opponents are already moving toward them. Passing lanes disappear, options disappear, time disappears, and yet this wasn't always normal. For a long time, many teams defended by waiting. They would drop back, hold their shape, protect dangerous areas, and react to what their opponents did. Then a different idea began to spread. What if you didn't wait? What if you attacked without the ball? What if defending wasn't passive? What if defending could be aggressive? One of the pioneers of this thinking was Arrigo Sacchi. Sacchi believed football should move as one connected system. If one player pressed, everyone pressed. If one player stepped forward, everyone followed. To him, football wasn't 11 individuals. It was one organism moving together. At the time, many people thought the idea was extreme. Today, it feels completely normal, and that's because football spent decades moving closer and closer to Sacchi's vision. Then came managers who pushed those ideas even further. Jürgen Klopp turned pressing into a weapon. Pep Guardiola turned positioning into an art form. Marcelo Bielsa turned intensity into an obsession. And together, they helped reshape how football is played. But here's the important thing. Pressing isn't really about winning the ball, at least not immediately. Pressing is about taking away choices. Imagine you're driving a car. You have 10 roads you could take. Now imagine someone closes 9 of them. Suddenly your decision becomes predictable. That's exactly what pressing does. It doesn't just pressure players, it pressures decisions. And once football discovered how powerful that could be, there was no going back. Because every successful team started proving the same thing. The less time your opponent has, the more mistakes they make. And football began evolving around that idea. Not every team copied Guardiola. Not every team copied Klopp. But almost every successful team adopted one principle. Give your opponent less space. Give your opponent less time. Force them into mistakes. And as that philosophy spread across Europe and beyond, football started becoming smaller. Not literally. The pitch didn't shrink, but the usable space did. And that changed everything. Because once teams learned how to take away space, the next question became even more important. What happens when there isn't any left? Here's something strange. The football pitch hasn't changed size. It's still about 105 meters long. It's still about 68 meters wide. The dimensions are almost exactly what they've been for decades. And yet, modern football feels like it's being played in a phone booth. Why? Because space isn't measured by the size of the pitch. It's measured by how much freedom a player has. And that's where modern football changed everything. Think about a midfielder receiving the ball in 2006. He might have 2 or 3 seconds before someone closed him down, enough time to take a touch, look around, assess his options, maybe even take another touch. Now think about the same situation today. The moment the ball arrives, an opponent is already accelerating toward him. Another player is blocking the passing lane. A third player is anticipating where he wants to go next. The space technically exists, but functionally, it's gone. And that is the secret behind modern football. Teams have become incredibly good at making space disappear, not by standing still, but by moving together. Watch the best teams in the world: Manchester City, Liverpool, Arsenal, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich. They don't just defend players, they defend space. Sometimes they don't even care who has the ball. What they care about is controlling the areas around it. And once you understand that, modern football starts making a lot more sense. Suddenly, those sideways passes don't look pointless. Those constant movements off the ball don't look random. That midfielder pointing and shouting every 30 seconds isn't being dramatic. He's directing traffic. He's helping control space. Because football's most important battles often happen nowhere near the ball, and this is where many fans unknowingly miss half the game. We're naturally drawn to the ball. The cameras follow the ball. The commentators talk about the ball. But managers are often watching something completely different. They're watching distances, spacing, structure, shape. Because one player being 2 meters out of position can create a chain reaction that affects the entire team. It's like removing a single brick from a wall. At first, nothing seems wrong. Then suddenly the whole structure starts wobbling. That's why elite football today looks so organized, and why it can also collapse so quickly. When one player gets dragged out of position, space appears. When space appears, opportunities appear. And in modern football, opportunities don't stay open for very long. That's why the best players today aren't always the fastest, or the strongest, or even the most technically gifted. Often they're simply the best at understanding space. Take someone like Rodri. If you only watch the highlights, you might wonder why coaches and players speak about him with such admiration. He rarely produces spectacular dribbles. He doesn't score every week. He's not the fastest player on the pitch. But Rodri understands space. He knows where to stand. He knows when to move. He knows how to make himself available. And in modern football, that's an incredibly valuable skill. Because while football fans often focus on what players do with the ball, elite football increasingly revolves around what players do without it. And once teams started mastering space, another transformation began. Because if space became football's most valuable resource, then every position on the pitch had to evolve. The goalkeeper, the defenders, the midfielders, the forwards. Everyone suddenly had a new job description. And nowhere was that change more dramatic than at fullback. If a football fan from 2005 suddenly woke up in 2025, there are a lot of things that would confuse them. The pressing, the speed, the tactical language. But nothing would confuse them more than the fullbacks, because for most of football history, the fullback's job was relatively straightforward. Defend your side of the pitch, stop crosses, support the attack when possible, get back quickly. Simple. Nobody expected fullbacks to run the game. Nobody expected them to dictate possession. Nobody expected them to become some of the most important players on the pitch. And yet that's exactly what happened. Modern football didn't just change how teams played. It changed who was responsible for making teams play. Suddenly managers began looking at the pitch differently. They realized something. The center of the pitch was becoming crowded. Everyone wanted control of midfield. Everyone wanted numerical superiority. Everyone wanted to dominate possession. But if everybody was fighting for the same space, where could you find an advantage? The answer was unexpected. The fullback. And once that idea took hold, football changed again. Take Philipp Lahm, one of the smartest footballers of his generation. Pep Guardiola didn't see Lahm as just a defender. He saw him as a footballer, someone capable of solving problems wherever they appeared. Sometimes Lahm would start at fullback and finish in midfield. Sometimes he seemed to be playing both positions simultaneously. And once coaches saw that possibility, the floodgates opened. Years later, players like João Cancelo would make it look almost normal. A fullback stepping into midfield, helping build attacks, creating overloads, controlling possession. What would have looked bizarre 20 years ago suddenly became standard practice. Then came Trent Alexander-Arnold, a player who sparked endless debates. Is he a defender, a midfielder, a playmaker? The answer is complicated because modern football itself has become more complicated. Positions are no longer fixed in the way they once were. They're fluid, flexible, situational. And that's one of the biggest reasons football looks different today. The game has become less about positions and more about functions. A manager doesn't simply ask, what position does this player play? They ask, what problem does this player solve? That's a completely different way of thinking. And once teams embraced that idea, traditional football positions started breaking apart. Fullbacks became midfielders, wingers became playmakers, strikers became creators, goalkeepers became distributors. The labels remained, but the responsibilities changed, which brings us to one of the most fascinating developments in modern football: the rise of players who don't seem to fit any traditional position at all. Think about someone like Jude Bellingham, or Jamal Musiala, or Florian Wirtz. Trying to describe them using old football language feels almost impossible, because they're products of a new era, an era where versatility has become one of the most valuable qualities in the sport. Managers no longer want specialists. They want footballers who can adapt, footballers who can occupy multiple spaces, footballers who can solve multiple problems. And that shift has made football richer, more complex, more demanding. But it has also created something unexpected, because as positions became more fluid, one manager's ideas began spreading across football faster than anyone else's. A manager whose influence can be found almost everywhere, even in teams that don't play like his, even among coaches who claim they disagree with him, even among fans who insist they don't enjoy watching his teams, whether they realize it or not. They're all living in football's Guardiola era. There are very few people in football who can genuinely claim to have changed the sport. Not won it, not dominated it, changed it. Pep Guardiola is one of them. Now, whether you love Guardiola or can't stand watching his teams is almost irrelevant, because this isn't really about Pep Guardiola. It's about what happened after Pep Guardiola. That's where the real story begins. When Guardiola arrived at Barcelona in 2008, football had already been evolving. The ideas of Johan Cruyff, the positional principles, the obsession with controlling the ball, none of those things were entirely new, but Guardiola combined them in a way that football had never quite seen before. His Barcelona team wasn't just winning, they were controlling games. Sometimes it felt like their opponents barely touched the ball. And that created something dangerous, not for Barcelona, for everyone else. Because football is a copycat sport. When something works, people copy it. When something wins trophies, people copy it faster. And when something dominates football for years, everybody starts studying it. Managers, analysts, scouts, players, entire clubs, everyone wanted answers. How do we stop this? How do we replicate this? How do we compete with this? And those questions triggered an explosion of tactical innovation. Some coaches copied Guardiola directly. Others built systems specifically designed to beat him. But either way, they were responding to the same challenge. And that's why his influence spread far beyond the teams he actually managed. Look around modern football. The evidence is everywhere. Goalkeepers are expected to play with their feet. Center backs are expected to build attacks. Midfielders constantly rotate positions. Teams create numerical advantages all over the pitch. These ideas didn't appear out of nowhere. They became mainstream because football spent years searching for ways to gain even the smallest advantage. And Guardiola's teams forced everyone to think harder, to innovate faster, to evolve. But here's the interesting part. The Guardiola era isn't really about possession. That's what most fans remember. The endless passing, the control, the dominance. But underneath all of that was something much more important. Space. Again, everything comes back to space. His teams weren't obsessed with possession because passing looked beautiful. They were obsessed with possession because possession controls space. If your team has the ball, your opponent has to react. Your opponent has to move, your opponent has to chase, and eventually, space opens somewhere. Maybe only for a second, maybe only for 2 meters. But at the highest level, that's enough. That's why modern football often looks like a giant chess match, because every movement has a purpose. Every run changes the shape of the board. Every pass forces a reaction. Every reaction creates a new possibility. And that's one of the reasons modern football fascinates coaches so much. The game has become incredibly sophisticated, sometimes almost invisible. A casual viewer might see a sideways pass. A coach sees three defenders shifting position, a midfielder creating a passing lane, a winger pinning a fullback, and an entire attack slowly taking shape. Football didn't become more complicated because people wanted it to. Football became more complicated because every generation kept searching for an edge, and eventually, the margins became incredibly small. Today, elite football is often decided by details that would have gone unnoticed 20 years ago. A player's body position, a pressing trigger, a passing lane, a movement off the ball. Tiny details, massive consequences. And that's where modern football finds itself now. Teams are more organized than ever. Players are more athletic than ever. Analysts have more data than ever. Managers have more information than ever. Which raises an interesting question. If football has evolved this much already, what happens next? Because history suggests something important. Football never stands still for very long. If football teaches us anything, it's this. The game never stays silent. Every tactical revolution eventually creates a counter-revolution. Every dominant idea eventually meets resistance. Every advantage eventually disappears. That's why football keeps changing, and that's why it will continue changing long after this video is over. Think about it. There was a time when the 4-4-2 looked unstoppable. Then football evolved. There was a time when possession football seemed impossible to stop. Then football evolved. There was a time when pressing felt revolutionary. Now it's almost expected. Football is constantly solving itself, and then reinventing itself, which means the question isn't whether football will change again. The question is how. One answer is already obvious. Data. Modern football is swimming in information. Every sprint, every pass, every movement, every touch, everything can be measured, everything can be analyzed, everything can be compared. Today's coaches have access to information that previous generations could only dream about, and clubs are using that information to gain advantages everywhere. Recruitment, training, recovery, match preparation, tactical planning, nothing is left untouched. The modern game has become a partnership between football and information. But here's what's fascinating. Data hasn't replaced football intelligence. It's made football intelligence even more valuable, because having information isn't the same as understanding it. The clubs that succeed aren't necessarily the ones with the most data. They're often the ones that ask the best questions. And that brings us to another trend, positionless football. For decades, football was organized around clear roles: goalkeeper, defender, midfielder, forward. Simple. Today, those lines are becoming increasingly blurred. A defender might step into midfield. A winger might become a playmaker. A striker might spend half the game creating space for someone else. The game is becoming more fluid, more adaptable, more unpredictable. And that's exactly what coaches want. Because if your opponent knows where every player will be, you're easier to stop. But if your players can occupy multiple spaces and perform multiple roles, defending becomes much harder. The future may belong to footballers who can do everything. Not specialists, problem solvers, players who understand space rather than positions. Players who can interpret situations rather than simply follow instructions. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson from football's evolution. The game isn't moving toward rigidity, it's moving toward intelligence. Toward players who can think faster, adapt faster, understand faster. Which is ironic when you think about it, because football appears more structured than ever. The shapes are organized, the systems are rehearsed, the movements are planned. But underneath all of that structure is creativity. Decision-making, human intelligence, the very things that make football impossible to fully predict. And that's why, despite all the data, all the tactics, and all the planning, football still surprises us. A team can dominate possession and lose. An underdog can shock the world. A tactical master plan can fall apart in 90 minutes, because football is still played by people, and people remain beautifully unpredictable. Maybe that's why we keep watching, not because football has been solved, but because it hasn't, and perhaps it never will be. Every generation believes it understands the game, then football changes again, and we're forced to learn something new, which brings us back to where we started. Back to that feeling that modern football somehow looks different. Because it does. Not because the pitch changed, not because the rules changed, but because the ideas changed. and ideas have always been football's most powerful force. The next time you watch a football match, try something. For a few moments, forget about the ball. Watch the space instead. Watch how quickly players close each other down. Watch how entire teams move together. Watch how one run can open space somewhere else. Watch the players who never appear in the highlights, the ones creating options, blocking passing lanes, manipulating defenders, solving problems before they even happen. Because that's where modern football really lives, not just in the goals, not just in the moments that go viral, but in the invisible battles happening all over the pitch. The battle for space, the battle for time, the battle for control. And once you start seeing those battles, something interesting happens. Football becomes even more enjoyable. You stop watching 22 players chase a ball and start watching a game of ideas, a game of decisions, a game of constant adaptation. You start reading the game, and maybe that's the biggest reason football looks different today. Not because it became a different sport, but because the people inside it learned new ways to think. The next revolution is already coming. Some manager somewhere is already experimenting with an idea that looks strange today, just as pressing once looked strange, just as inverted fullbacks once looked strange, just as positional play once looked strange. And one day, that idea might reshape football again. When it does, most people probably won't notice it immediately, just like they didn't notice this revolution. At least not at first. But now you will. Because football didn't stop evolving. We simply stopped noticing. Until now. This has been The Fixture. Read the game.